All right. Hello and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning as we discuss climate and migration, the intersection of these two phenomena and the complexities that result as we examine them through different disciplines. Featuring our wonderful panelists we have with us today. We're really pleased to be able to present this conversation. This is a partnership event put on by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln across a few departments. I am with the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, but also the School of Natural Resources and the Drought Mitigation Center, the Department of Modern Languages, and the School of Global Integrated Studies. We are pleased to participate in a larger event this week that this discussion is a part of, called the SDG Action and Awareness Week. And this event, or this week-long kind of observance, is put on by the University Global Coalition, a national and international group of universities that are committed towards action to the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that, I won't waste any more time. I am very pleased to have our three panelists who come from very different disciplines and backgrounds and have life experiences to contribute to this conversation. But I am going to let them introduce themselves as I think they will do so best. Florencio, can I have you begin?
Perfect. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So my name is Florencio. I'm from Colombia, but currently I'm based in Brazil. My background, basically, I study international businesses, but also I have graduate studies in social innovation, entrepreneurship, and sustainability. I'm one of the UPG Sustainability Leadership, part of the UPG Sustainability Leadership Program. I also currently work in promoting water and renewable energy for South America and also some countries in Africa. And also I currently part of the major group of children and youth that is the mandate from the United Nations to integrate youth people and children to the UN system. I'm one of the migration focal points for Latin America. And also I'm part of the Water Youth Network, that is a platform to integrate what youth professionals that are working in the field. So yeah, that's me, and it's really a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Florencio. Sagai, can you continue?
Okay, my name is Sagai Taddasa. I'm a research professor at the School of Natural Resources. I work for the National Drought Mitigation Center as Geospatial Coordinator. My research interest is on drought monitoring tools and development. That includes satellite data, climate data, and also biophysical parameters like irrigation, elevation, and other parameters. I have also worked as a senior consultant for developing a framework for drought risk management for Africa. As a senior FAO consultant, I have worked with a team of experts at FAO, World Meteorological Organization. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. And Julia, can you round us out?
Sure. So I'm a little bit different here. I am Juliet Frangs. I'm an associate professor of French and Francophone studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. My research focuses on the regions of French Polynesia and New Caledonia, so Oceania, which is in the Pacific. And through my research on Pacific Ocean literature, I really became interested in environmental literature. So I have been working on eco-criticism and getting involved in the environmental humanities. For the past probably 4 or 5 years now, I've been focusing on environmental literature, and I teach a course on environmental literature in about an hour and a half. And my next book will be focused on environmental literature of the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are really so lucky to have this really interesting group of individuals here contributing the unique perspectives of their disciplines. And I think that most of us can agree that we can gain a lot from hearing from an interesting perspective, a diverse array of perspectives of disciplines as we address some of these complex issues and intersecting issues as we have in our discussion today. So we're going to begin with some of our questions. And please, audience, feel free to put questions in the chat if you are interested in addressing a question or following up on something as we are, having it on the table at that moment, or you can wait till we will have a short Q&A session at the end of our kind of preset array of questions. So with that, I will begin. This question is to all of the group. Please, we would love to have all of your perspectives here on this question. How does your point of view in the world view the two complex phenomena of climate change, and migration, and how they may or may not interact? There's a lot of complexity around their relationship, and I would love to hear from all of you as an introductory sort of discussion.
I can start. When we say climate change, it's different from climate variability. We should start from that. There is a misconception between climate change and climate variability. The climate variability is typically short-term fluctuations, seasonal fluctuation of rainfall, for example, or temperature. One year it could be drought, the other year would be normal or wet. When we say climate change, it's the term that refers to sustained long-term climate change. That could be measured in decades or 10 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years on a local, regional, and global scale. So this climate change, different studies have shown us that there is extreme weather, like drought and floods, are really frequent in the coming years. So all the projections, the climate model projections show us there is frequent droughts and floods. IPCC has puts in its report those kinds of what kinds of extremes, climate extremes could happen in different parts of the world. So this climate change could cause migration. This climate change and the related climate extremes, as I mentioned, drought and floods, that could cause human migration around the globe. So that's whenever that happens, people could migrate. And this, what we call it, climate migrants, those are the people who leave their homes because of climate stressors. When climate stressors, we say climate stressors, as I mentioned, changing in rainfall, heavy flood, sea level rise, and these kinds of extremes put pressure on people to leave their homes and livelihoods behind and then move to another place. So it makes their homes uninhabitable. That's why people are moving from one place to another to find their own basic needs. So that's the connection from my perspective.
Julia, Florencio, feel free to chime in.
Well, I think he summed it up really well, about making the connection between what climate change, why people might migrate due to climate change. I think a lot of the literature that I read is either anticipatory in that it is kind of like futuristic and it envisions what is going to happen when there's some sort of natural disaster and, well, related to climate change, right? And people will leave their homes, or it is post actual disaster. So for instance, post the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, we see a lot of literature coming from that time in the 5 to 7 years after that earthquake. And I'm sure that we'll see more soon here, since this past summer there was another devastating earthquake in Haiti. So I think this is, it's kind of hard to make the connection in literature, because a lot of what we see are migrant narratives that focus really on the actual migration aspect, and that don't focus necessarily on what caused people to migrate. So I think that'll be interesting. And I do think that this is going to be more, this connection is going to be made more clear in the future, in literature in the future, because I think that that writers are becoming more aware of the connections between climate change and migration. But that is my addition from my literary perspective.
Absolutely. And that's the point of this discussion, is we're kind of approaching these complex issues from different places. And we're not necessarily focusing on, okay, A causes B. We're talking about how these two very complicated sort of phenomena intersect. Sometimes they are in parallel, sometimes they are exacerbating each other, sometimes not, and maybe in unexpected ways. So we are just looking at this in a broad perspective as your discipline allows. Thank you, Juliet. Florencio, please.
Well, I want to add from the perspective of working with water supply technologies in Latin America, something that I have seen is that is a growth in the lack of water resources, and also a growth in food scarcity, and thus increase the migration patterns, because also at national and international levels. Because, for example, if a farmer needs water for the cattle and they don't have now near to the river they used to use for that, they need to move to another place to find that water. Or, for example, if they don't have now the environmental conditions to work in the field or to have crops in their area, they are forced to move to another place. And most of the time also they are forced to move from rural areas to urban areas. That creates more complexity in the process that we are thinking. And unfortunately, I think that this kind of situation that we are seeing now, that people is forced because of climate change to move from one place to another, is something, as Julia said, that we are going to keep seeing on the future. Also, according to the IPCC report that was released like a few days ago, it says that in the next year, almost 140 million people will be environmental or refugee migrants because of climate change. So it's something that will happen to several regions of the world, not just in Latin America, not just in Asia, just like all of us will be subject in some point of our lives to maybe be forced to move because of climate change. So now that is the relation that I see.
These are great points, and you each kind of bring up the idea of the subtlety and the kind of complicated nature sometimes that these two phenomena have with each other. Sometimes there's kind of a point A that is impacted, or a point C, and then that has its own implications further on. My next question for all or any of you who have a perspective on it is that, do you think that climate change, for example, or climate variability, per your good points, Sagai, does it impact or lead in some ways to conflict? Do you think that that conflict can happen just over resource availability, for example, over agricultural productivity, kind of like you've mentioned, Florencio? And do you think that leads to, or perhaps on the contrary, impedes migration, depending on the situation of the people in question and in the area in question?
Well, climate is a threat multiplier. It can exacerbate economic insecurity or political instability, which in turn may lead also to migration. In the dry corridor of Africa, for example, Ethiopia, climate change extremes like drought may hinder crop production or struggle for water resources. And for example, these small-scale farmers would have reduced production and productivity. That's indirect risk of endangered livelihoods for these farmers, especially if there are limited options for diversification. So they would have that big problems, and they have to migrate. And whenever you have immigration and you are going to somewhere else, and then that sometimes could be it could cause conflicts. For example, in Ethiopia, when I say Ethiopia, I'm originally from Ethiopia, so I'm giving you examples of my own experience. There's a drought-prone area like the Afar region. They are pastoralists. They rely on their herds of camels, cattle, sheep, and goats to survive, and frequently move around in order to find water in the dry, harsh deserts. So when they move to where there is water, and because of the drought is not only limited to a certain one area, and that causes conflicts. So this climate change on environment could lead to not only local geopolitical changes that threaten to destabilize already vulnerable regions. The stress on natural resources undermine the capacity of the country to govern themselves and increase the chance of conflicts.
I guess I will add my 2 cents here. I did want to point out that climate migrants are called climate migrants because they are not granted the status of refugees. Yeah. In international law, they do not have the status of refugees. So when they do migrate, they do not get to apply for asylum or any of those kinds of things. They are not considered refugees like political refugees. Refugees are, that term is generally used for political refugees, right? So they may be leaving for an urgent reason, right? But they do not have the same types of resources or the same types of recourse, right? That refugees would have. People who would be available for the refugee status, they would not be able to have that. And so I think just because of that fact, that does make conflict more possible, right? Because they would not be able to get the safety afforded to them by this refugee status in whatever country that they migrate to.
That's a great distinction, Julia. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Florencio, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think that definitely, I think that migration and climate change will create in sort of way conflict. For example, we have seen for several years that there are nations that are fighting for transboundary resources of water. I mean, for example, we have here the Amazon rainforest, and also we have the Amazon River that is between Colombia, Peru, Brazil. And as governments, they have been fighting for several years in who owns which part of the river. But also now we have seen that this kind of discussion is also being part of conflicts in their own population, because when we start to see these migration patterns and people start to move, the community that has been living their whole life and their survival depends on that resource, when they see other people coming because they have to leave their own house because they have different types of situations happening then, and they start to get into that new community, they say, hold on, we have now more people, less resources, and that creates conflict. And it's something that I think that is related. While we can control how we can make it more sustainable, in order that, as we know that because of climate change, we are creating these patterns, how now we can use the resources that we have in order that they can supply not just the communities that have been here for years or decades, but also the newcomers that are forced to move here. So definitely, I think that climate change is going to be something that we have to think about how that imply in different kind of conflicts.
Certainly. Thank you, Florencio. We have actually a question from our audience here, which I think is an excellent one. Ischel asks, do you think climate change influences differently different types of migrations? And this was actually a question I was planning to ask, because migration doesn't always mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can be transnational, it can be internal. Is the impact more on maybe one, more on the other, or the same? And they mention that because Florencio was mentioning about rural to urban areas due to maybe impacts on agriculture, for example. Any thoughts from any of the panelists on this?
I'll just add in here that since I work on the Pacific region, right, the Pacific has a lot of islands that speak different languages, right? There are a lot of independent islands. French Polynesia, for example, has 121 different islands. And a lot of them speak French, but a lot of them also speak their different indigenous languages. So I think in terms of language, it does make a difference, right? Because people say in Kiribati, right, is about to just be completely gone. They're going to have to move somewhere else, and they can move places where they speak the same language, but they still are going to have to go through all of the different things, political things that they have to do to become citizens of a different country, right? I think what's going to happen in the Pacific is people are going to move to countries where they speak similar languages, or where they have a language in common, like English, for example. But then eventually they're going to have to move again, right? Because the Pacific is really one of the more delicate regions in the world. So they are eventually going to have to move somewhere where they don't speak a language, and that's going to create all kinds of different impacts. So I think, yes, it impacts different types of migrations differently, just simply in terms of language and location, right? Because if somebody moves from the Caribbean to the United States, but it's a US Virgin Island, right, they're going to be able to speak English, but they're still going to have to go through the passport rigmarole, right, and becoming US citizens and everything. And how easy is the US going to make that for their citizens? How easy is Australia going to make it for people to migrate to Australia? So I think it is going to be different depending on the location.
The impact, usually the migration is the vulnerable areas are rural areas. So from rural areas to urban areas, they could be internally displaced. So that would be one of the challenge for the country within. But there are also, across the country, border, and the policies might be different, and getting the resources is also really a challenge. And so that also makes them different. And the urban one also, because of, say, for example, those in the coastal areas could also be migrated because of flooding. Heavy flooding could be displaced. And that's also could be considered as one of the climate change impact on environment that could displace them. A very good point that Julia raised is they are not legally migrants. And so that's also really a big challenge to address those vulnerable people and help them.
Yeah, I just want to add also my 2 cents here. And I think that in terms of numbers, maybe I don't have the complete data, but definitely most of the time people, when they have to migrate from rural areas to urban areas, is an internal movement. This kind of migration occurs into the country. But unfortunately, something that we have seen is also that because what happened when people have to migrate from rural areas to urban areas, you already have a gap, because people have in rural areas different capacities that they know how to create or cultivate or have different capacities compared from people that is used to live in urban areas. So when they don't find those kind of opportunities, what they see is, if I can't see in the urban areas that I live, and also I don't have the environmental conditions to go back to the rural areas, maybe I will try to go to somewhere, some place else. Something that we have seen that is quite interesting. So I have seen a move, for example, in Portugal. They are receiving a lot of migrants that used to work in the fields, in crops in their country, but unfortunately they don't own the land. So they say, I can't work into my country because we don't have land. So they hire them to go to Portugal and help them to cultivate there, in order that they can, as they don't know that they have the capacities, they can work, but it's in a country totally different. When, as Julia said, that also creates another problem, because you have cultural barriers, you have language barriers, and that makes that migration is not sustainable, and most of the time they don't have the opportunity to have this growth or health of conditions that they deserve. So definitely, just to answer the question, most of the time these parents are from into the country, but we have seen many cases that people also now is forced to move to other countries in order to keep or having the chance to keep their social and economic growth, as they don't have that opportunity in their own countries because of climate change.
Exactly, exactly. These are great points. I wanted to bring up the idea too. When we think of migration, we don't always think of seasonal migration that comes alongside a lot of agricultural production systems in the US, in Portugal, in many places in the world, and how climate variability or long-term climate change may impact the time period in which some of these normal migrations happen, or maybe they don't happen at all because of some of these extremes in weather. So just other things to think about as we consider those complexities. I wanted to ask this question, and Sagai, you put this out there about talking about vulnerable individuals, and I wanted to address that more specifically. Climate change and variability most often disproportionately impact the vulnerable people. This could be an individual in a refugee camp, perhaps, or in a conflict area where maybe it's not possible to leave. What do you think, or how does that dynamic play out as you have perceived it, each of you, in the lens of your discipline, please? And how do you think, maybe after that, that governments or industry or non-governmental organizations could help to mitigate that risk to vulnerable individuals?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. There are short-term, like the climate variability, drought could happen, especially in poor areas. That would be really a challenge. The challenge would be increased because of the high levels of poverty, and also rapid population growth and reliance on rain-fed agriculture. And so they should move seasonally to certain areas, like, for example, internally displaced from one area, rural area, to urban. And then you can mitigate that with resources nationally, for example. And then when it comes to normal, then you can bring them back. The biggest challenge is with the climate change. And the land cover would also change. The soil also would change, and for those smaller scale farmers. And so there should be some kinds of a policy for adaptation and mitigation measures that should be considered earlier. A kind of preemptive action should be done. There should be some kinds of a policy that the government should have. And in risk management in particular, there are three risk management components that the government should consider in order to develop the policy. One is the monitoring of these climate-related extremes and early warning. And the second one is vulnerability and impact assessment. This is just to determine the primary, historical, the current, and the likely or the future impacts associated with those climate extremes. I work on the drought and for drought, and to assess the root cause of these impacts on people. It differs, when drought happens, for example, here in Nebraska versus in developing countries such as Ethiopia, it's different. And so you have to study that local and national level, what kinds of impacts would be, and what are the root cause of these impacts. That is very important to study. The third one is actually, as you mentioned, in mitigation and preparedness and response. There should be the appropriate measures and actions that are aimed at reducing the vulnerability of these climate-related extremes and reducing the impacts of this climate-related extreme, such as droughts or floods. So those kinds of things should be done by the government and international organizations, especially when we are considering the globally. The development of these pre-impact government programs, which are intended to reduce vulnerability and impacts, are very important, should be in their policy. So there are two kinds of management. One is the crisis management, and the other one is risk management. The crisis management is when it happens, then you start to address it and help them, international community, regional, and everyone would just go and then try to help and reduce the impact. But lots of lives would perish because of that. But this approach is risk management approach is considering these three pillars or three components of risk management. You can be prepared and reduce the vulnerability of those climate-related impacts. I'm not sure if I understood your question right. Is that okay? Okay. Julia would add if I miss anything.
I don't think you missed anything. I guess I was thinking about this question in terms of, so the question is, how does this impact poorer people or more vulnerable people more than it impacts people who have access to resources? And I don't have the scientific vocabulary that can discuss that, but I can talk about what literature can do to help us think through the severity of migration that might be forced through climate change and whether or not people can actually migrate. And there are a couple texts that address this issue. One is called, this is a 2011 academic text by Rob Nixon called "Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor." And in this text, Nixon talks a lot about he discusses literature written from people living in India who are really affected by climate change and kind of insidious state-run or state decisions, right, that impact their land, but they might make choices that seem to go against the idea of protecting the earth, right? And that is because they are vulnerable and they're making the economic decision that is best for them, right? And so so it's important to read these texts, to think about those types of decisions. And then in 2016, Amitav Ghosh wrote "The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable," where he talks about what literature can do to help us kind of get our heads around climate change. So he says that that natural disasters, environmental catastrophes, and even the more insidious, seemingly invisible elements contributing to climate change are unrepresentable events. And so they're either beyond or outside of our conceptual field of discursive representation. So when they do emerge in literature, it's usually through a metaphoric language. And that is the best way to be able to reach people, right, is through metaphoric language, because sometimes the reality is so difficult to grasp. And then another thing that I wanted to mention is that while statistics and news reports are very important for in being able to understand the impacts of climate change, they depersonalize the true impacts, right? And what literature can do is help us become closer to the situation, right? Literary and poetic testimonials can convey the impact. And talking about the vulnerable is difficult, right? Because usually writers who are writing about these situations have the privilege of having a job that doesn't earn a lot of money, actually, and they have the privilege to be able to write about this, right? So I think that's part of the reason why we don't see a lot of climate migrants testimonials in literature, is because it's not an economically viable profession. But I think what the authors who do have the means to be able to write this kind of literature, what they do is they render visible, otherwise invisible, traumatic events, and they help us realize, or at least maybe help motivate us to think about what we can do to help the more vulnerable among us.
Exactly. And thank you, Julia, for contributing that as well. We don't mean to kind of amplify or diminish any one perspective here. I think that you bring up a very important point, that we have to have multiple manners of approaching these issues and multiple manners of understanding from a scientific and statistical standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a human and personal sort of standpoint as well. So thank you for that.
And I do want to say that the numbers are important, right?
Of course they are. We need to have all of these things.
All of it is important, and I didn't want to diminish that either.
I just want to add something that Julia mentioned, and I really find really interesting, and is to see that sometimes when we see reports that talk about climate change and migration, and you see that sometimes they forget to put into the table or have the voice of people that is part of the community of grassroots organizations. So many times the information is there, but it's disconnected with the reality. And I also say that, yeah, numbers are really important, but also it's really important that people don't see migrants as numbers in a report and as human beings that deserve a human treatment. So I just want to say that, but also how we can, the thing that how the most vulnerable are sort of suffering because of climate change and migration. One thing that I want to say, for example, is how we are losing this cultural heritage, talking about indigenous communities, for example, in the Amazon rainforest that have been there for several years, and because of deforestation now are forcing to move. And when they move, they have the culture, they own culture, but sometimes that when you disconnect them from their territories, you lose part of it. And for example, many of people that live in several areas that don't have the basic conditions to live, but are areas that are used, for example, illegal mining, and many illegal groups are working in that areas and force them to move. That creates migration. So I think that it's really important that we always think in this perspective of how migration and climate migration needs to have a special attention in those that are more marginalized. I'm talking to women, I'm talking to children and youth, indigenous communities, Black communities, and other minorities. So it's extremely important that when we think, as we have several situations that are forcing migration, but we have to create policies or thinking policies that also cover those ones that are more marginalized. So I think that the question was really important, that we can see migration as a whole because we have different perspectives into the same migration. As we were discussing, it's different to talk as we have climate migrants that maybe they have a flood in their neighborhood and they have to move, but we also have refugees that maybe they lose not that happen not just in their home, they lose the whole town. So all the town was forced to move to another place. So I think that it's really important that we think in migration and climate migration in different perspectives, and how we cannot leave no one behind when we think about it.
Excellent points, Florencio. Thank you. I have to give a little credit to one of our participants who pointed me in the direction of an interesting perspective that I'm going to bring up here. So thank you, Elena Chernikova, for pointing us in this direction. There are some who would posit that there actually is not as much of a connection between climate related events and migration. For example, Hein de Haas, a Dutch environmental sociologist and geographer, posits that it's not nearly as connected, at least directly, as many would say it would be, that maybe sometimes governments or industries may overemphasize this connection as a way to kind of excuse themselves from responsibility for certain impacts towards especially vulnerable people or people who just may happen to be located in an inconvenient place for this country, maybe for tourist perspectives or gain in their perspective. He talks about how specifically things like rural to urban migration may not in fact have anything to do with these with climate related events, that they are just a natural progression and a modernization, industrialization of the world. What are your thoughts on this perspective that they are not as connected as perhaps some would think, and can people or governments take advantage of that supposed connection?
Well, I don't see the advantage that the government would have. After all, the government has a responsibility to govern, and so whether it is because of natural the disaster that they have to move, or the urbanization. So in both ways, there should be preparedness and plan to do to reduce the impacts of natural disasters because of climate change. So yes, I know, for example, they use it for, to displace people because of drought. And that happened actually in the 1990s in Ethiopia, because of the drought-prone areas, and government took them, took them and settled them in areas which the government thought is the better one. And people didn't like it. And they wanted to be in their own local area and get help and then mitigate or adapt the situation. And so they can use that. And so, but blaming on drought and not being prepared for that shouldn't let them, free of the blame. So yes, they can use it for a political game, but it is playing with the lives of people.
Right, exactly. I appreciate that example, specifically in Ethiopia that you bring up. I think an example of De Haas that he brought up in his piece was that certain South Pacific island nation governments had said, oh, well, there's an emergency, you must leave right now, and you cannot stay here because of the imminent impacts of climate change, when in fact it was for the purposes of having more touristic availability of that same kind of valuable real estate. So interested in hearing anyone else's perspective on that.
So I didn't know about this, about people in the Pacific getting, I don't put it past them. I'm sure that it happened, that government said that they needed to clear out because of climate change and that they just really wanted to use it for tourism. I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. Because this has been happening for a long time. In France, French Polynesia is part of France and they have French passports. And in the 1960s, France installed a nuclear testing base in Moruroa and Fangataofa and set off aerial and underwater missiles for 30 years. And so that displaced people from those outlying atolls and into Papeete, which is the capital city of Tahiti, right? So the bigger island. So there was some internal migration that happened there due to climate. It wasn't climate change, it was climate violence. So I think that it is very true that governments often will say that it's climate change when it's actually climate violence that is clearly human caused. So I don't know, I agree. I don't know how they would get off any easier by saying it's climate change. But that's my 2 cents.
Florencio, did you have anything else to add to that one?
Maybe I just want to add that it's really common and maybe was also mentioned before that governments are really into development and adaptation, but most of the time not in mitigation. We have an example here in Brazil, like a few weeks ago, almost 250 people died because of flood in a city because it rains a lot and there are some changes on the season because most of the time in that time of the year they don't have that much rain and that caused several problems. So 250 people died. But something that could be mitigated is that like 5 years ago they had a similar situation. So there's when you say now not just we have this thing that several people unfortunately die. So a lot of people that live in that town that is called Petropolis now are being forced to move to one city to another because they don't have any place else to live. So I think that now that we are talking in governments are into policy making, how we can address climate migration, it's very important that they focus not just in adaptation, but also in mitigation, how we can act now in order that things don't happen in the future, because I think that migration should be free. Everyone should have the chance to move to the place they want. But most of the time people don't migrate because they want to, because they have to. So how we mitigate that people have to migrate, that they can have the chance to move because they want and not because they have. So I think that is really important that we thinking how we can mitigate all of these situations that are related with climate migration.
Certainly, certainly. I want to pull us kind of high level really briefly before we finish up. Because we are a U.S. educational institution and we have a focus on finding ways to encourage action among our faculty, staff, and students, particularly being able to encourage them that it's not a hopeless sort of situation, but there are things that they can do either now or later in their careers to help with some of these complex issues. A question from Caitlin Waller is, how would you recommend, maybe from each of your perspectives, as they are very different, how to engage students and young people in these issues, bring these topics, maybe these complex intersections into your discipline or your coursework, and increase, and this is quite a question, and maybe even increase engagement across disciplines or departments?
Well, education is very important, and it's not only at the college level, but these kinds of concepts should be developed earlier stage, at least in high school, and that would really help young generation to be aware of, and so that they can be prepared when they are adults. So giving that education is very important. And in college level, there are different people from different countries, for example, here in Nebraska, and sharing that experience is also very important. In that college level, there should be some kinds of education that would also reflect these kinds of disaster risk management concepts and how you can handle it. And I was just also reading Elena's question. Maybe you might go and ask that question. And how do you address those kinds of problems if it is, internationally? And there are NGOs that could also be collaborating. Countries to countries should be collaborated. Institute to institute should be collaborated. We are collaborating with African universities and to develop some kinds of risk management, and also to influence the policy of the government whenever these kinds of disaster, before this disaster happens, so that they can be prepared. And there's also this international migration from one country to another. And those countries also should collaborate together before those kinds of climate-related disasters, such as drought, happens. So if they do have that kinds of collaboration with the region, it could be, country to country, two countries, for example, which share the same border, so that they can, beyond the humanitarian assistance, they should also consider how they could just go back home when things are better. So those kinds of discussions and collaborations is very important.
And those collaborations and discussions are happening at the university level right now. I mean, there are things in progress right now that are interdisciplinary, and so people are working on them at the university level. I included the website for the sustainability. For UNL sustainability. So for a very practical hands-on way to get involved, you can check out that website. There's also I think Lincoln or Nebraska Citizens Climate Lobby, who does lobbying. So there are some really practical, tangible ways that you can get involved, but also I think just a second what Sagai said, learn, right? And I think some of the novels, Caitlin, you're one of my students, so so some of the things that these novels can teach us are things that science can't teach us, right? And some of the things that science can teach us, novels cannot teach us, right? So I think having a really broad view on what can be done, I think literature has the capacity to help us develop empathy, right? And to help us think about things in different ways. For example, about environmental justice, right? What is the best situation, or what is the best way to go about a certain scenario that has kind of murky ethical concerns. And I think literature helps us think about those things. So that's what I would say.
Well, I will share with you, and I have also an invitation for students or young people that is interested or involved in environmental climate change and migration. This year, we'll start the review of the Global Compact of Migration. And as the Migration, Youth and Children platform are the mandate to host several youth forums and talking around things that are related to migration. And obviously, environmental migrants and refugee migrants is something that we are going to address worldwide. So I'm going to share with you my email. So if anyone is interested to join one of these forums that we are going to do, you are invited to participate as individual, as organizations, or as a civil society, because those will be resources that we are going to present as public policy making in different levels, at high level and national levels and regional levels. So I'm going to share with you my email. So maybe if you are in any states in the United States, I can share with you the contact or our local focal point, and they can share with you also the information where this youth forum will be hosted. But my invitation is that we as youth people, it could be migrants or not migrants, climate change, we will, all of us will face climate change in any sense. So it's important to be prepared, but also to be involved in order that things change, because we can just let that the change come from governments or from organization. I think that we as civil society have a responsibility to make that change happen. So that's the invitation that maybe I left for the students and or youth people that are interested on the topic.
Excellent. I really appreciate the perspective from each of you. It reminds me of the phrase many little hammers, which is an agronomy term usually initially used for weed control from Matt Liebman and Eric Gallant, but it talks about how if you use many approaches, it can be a much more effective manner to work with a very difficult, wicked challenge, as many call these. And so I think as approaching these complex issues from many different directions and perspectives and manners is keenly important. I want to plug one small thing too, a way, if you are a University of Nebraska-Lincoln student or another student, please do get in contact. We have a program called the Sustainable Development Goals Scholars Program, and it allows you to pursue the goal or goals that are most interesting to you. And one of those is climate action, but it could also be peace, justice, and strong institutions, or something else that's, or gender equality, or some of the reduced inequalities that maybe relate more specifically to migration. And you can pursue these goals, take part in learning with peers around the world, and learn from experts at a global and local level, and from each other to understand these more deeply. But something we found is find out how interconnected many of these goals are as well. So if that's something that's interesting to you, I will also put my email in the chat for you to contact me about being involved in our inaugural class of SDG Scholars. Any last thoughts from our panelists? I know Julia has to be leaving shortly. Want to give you the opportunity if you want. Otherwise, we will just be thanking you for your very wonderful insights.
Sorry, apparently I couldn't type and talk at the same time, but I just wanted to send you my email address as well. And thank you for this opportunity to speak with you all.
Just a quick point to conclude. There are a lot of efforts, as Julia mentioned, to help out this concept and to address this issue. That should be strengthened. And also the other point is, theoretically, many people are really, developing different kinds of tools, concepts, environmental justice, and others. And what is still not really well developed is the implementation of that, changing the policy of the governments, so that that could help people from these impacts and help the vulnerable people.
Absolutely. I'll let Florencio jump in with the last comment.
Perfect. No, I just want to say thank you. It was really a pleasure to speak with you, to learn with you also, because I learned a lot. As we say, the idea was to have this different perspective. And also I think that the message is really important, that as we today talk in our own perspective, how we are addressing climate migration, what we are doing, or how we can do, I think that the most important also is the students or the people that is currently here today have that idea, how with the work that I'm doing, with what I am studying or what I'm planning to do, I'm going to address climate change and migration, because as I said, everyone is involved in this. So I think that's my last point. And thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to just really briefly share a slide from the University Global Coalition at the moment. And so they are the folks who have put on this larger event, the SDG Action and Awareness Week. So there are more events happening today and tomorrow, but there will be recordings of all of the events that took place this week related to the SDGs that have happened in universities in the US and outside of the US. There's also a survey here if that's something you'd be able to jump onto quickly. And there's also some interesting events there as well. So go ahead and check that out. But thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today from your various places, disciplines, perspectives. We are really grateful. And thank you to all of you who joined us live. Thanks to all of you who will see this as a recording after the fact. We are truly appreciative. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.